God's blessing us with some rain right now, so I figured we'd do a video, in the barn talking about hay. A quick note to hay. To start off, I guess we should kind of define what hay is and why it's different from dead grass. We'll go through the process quickly. When grass grows, it grows bottom up. We all know that. And when it dies top down. So, because all the nutrients, they're trying to keep the root system alive. So, when it's time to hey, we're struggling, we need nutrients back, puts that flower up, it gets the seeds going, that's its whole point. And then it starts dying back and it all the nutrients come back down and it's trying to keep that root system alive. Well, with hay, you let it grow up, and before it seeds, you don't want it to go to seed because a lot of nutrition goes to the seed, so it takes away from the plant. And before it matures too much, so you don't get so many stems, you come in and you cut out the bottom and you let it sit there and you let it dry out. So the nutrition's not as high as a live plant, but the moisture's low, so it'll last longer and you can store it. And you let it dry out, and then you bale it up, and that's how you get bales. Well, when you get a bale, to describe a bale, you're going to get basically there's four types. You're going to get a 2-string, which is going to be about 50 pounds, and it's called a 2-string because it's held together with 2 strings. It's going to be a little rectangle. It's like the normal small hay bale you see. Then you can go up and you get a little bit bigger bale. Most times it's about 100 pounds, and it's called a 3-string. It has 3 strings holding it together. Pretty simple. With that rectangle-ish shape, you can go up to like a 800 pound or 1,000 pound or a 1,200 pound bale, 2,000 pound bale. And yeah, that's a different category. You need a tractor. It's just a big bale. And then you have round bales, which are the ones that are round. So that's kind of the 4 different types. And they're all pretty self-explanatory, and they're all pretty simple, really. Within a bale, like if you get a 2-string and you cut it open, it'll almost break apart into flakes. They're called flakes. And they're almost always grippable with one hand, and they almost always come out together. Sometimes they fall apart when you're pulling them out, but it's going to be, there's going to be 10 flakes in a bale or 14 flakes. It depends on the hay type and how it was baled, but those are called flakes. So whenever someone ever says, yeah, hey, I feed my horse 2 flakes a day, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the actual flakes in the bale when it breaks apart. So now we got that covered. Now let's kind of talk about quality. Well, the statistic they use for feed quality, but hay quality, is TDN, total digestible nutrients. When you look up a hay type, this is brome. Where I was from in Texas, I'd never heard of brome. I moved to Kansas, and there's quite a bit of it here. B-R-O-M-E, brome. When you look up brome hay, it's going to say, oh, it has 9% protein or 8% protein, and it has a TDN of this, and it'll always say it varies, but then it'll say the statistics. Don't listen to them. That'd be my only recommendation. This is one of those things that you can't really count on those numbers. You can't really take the 10,000 foot view. Now you can take the basic view of this is this type of hay and it looks good quality. And most of the time looks are good in hay. Like in hay, looks aren't really deceiving. They're pretty legit. If it looks good, it is good. And that goes for alfalfa. When you break up an alfalfa and it's super green and there's a lot of leaf, if it looks good, it is good. Alfalfa is always going to have more protein pretty much than most others because it's a legume hay. There's legume hays and then there's grass hays. And when most people talk about hay, they talk about grass hay. And when they talk about alfalfa, they literally say alfalfa or alfalfa hay. So, yeah, brome hays, you'll get all these different things. And for the TDN, you want it to be as high as possible. But unless you're doing a hay test yourself, which aren't super difficult, but not super necessary either, unless you're doing some quality animals, don't count on the internet. The internet will lead you down a false path on what the numbers are going to be. So yeah, we kind of covered those points, talked about the nutrition of it. Now we talk about the actual quality of the hay. And so if someone says they're selling you brome hay, but then you look in the bale or you get home and you cut it open and it seems like there's a bunch of different type of grass species in there, then you got lied to. It's not brome hay, it's a mixture. Sometimes they call it pasture hay a lot of the times, or pasture cut. And it's always kind of going to be lower quality than average, than a specific hay. But most of the time it's fine. You know, with hay, you're trying to, most of the time, keep an animal pregnant through the winter. And you can kind of do both of those. I always kind of recommend a feed supplement, or I recommend you breed for hardy animals. But you kind of have to do one or the other. You know, you can't try to take a non-hardy animal through the winter on a lower quality diet, because then you'll get miscarriages, you'll get deformities, you'll have a hard birthing. You know, play your cards right, know what animals you have, know what you want, know where you want to go, and then, you know, play your feed that way. This is just one flake. The rest of this is very poor quality hay, and it was poor quality. He sold it to me cheap, like $2 a bale. That's cheaper than like straw, and animals will die on straw. There's a reason it's called straw and hay. If someone ever selling you straw to feed, don't feed it. Like your animals might eat it, they might chew on it, but they literally will starve to death with a stomach full of straw, because it's inert. There's no nutrition in it. No nutrition in it. So don't feed it. It's good bedding though, and that you can buy cheap hay for good bedding, and that's kind of what I did here. Not all of this was super low quality hay in these bales. There's stuff to eat in here, you know. The leafier the better. So this part I just pulled is actually pretty decent. But there was a lot of like thorny plants and stuff like that too, which isn't great bedding, but it'll do. It'll get, you know, pushed over, stepped on, peed on, whatever. And I could throw one of these cheap quality bales on the ground, and if the sheep even ate 10% of it, I was happy, because I was mainly using it for them to chew on some and then spread out and then compost. You know, it's under their feet. Their manure and pee, and they'll make it compost, and I can take it out and really compost it later. But that was the point, you know, and that's the point of the hay. Know what type of hay you're buying. If it's going to be Timothy, it's going to be something of the sort. Know what you're buying. Know what to expect. Know what it looks like. Like, to look up pictures, know what it looks like, so when you show up, and then you can show up and be like, hey, whoa, this is a mix, and the price might reflect that. The guy, you might show up and be like, hey, you said this was alfalfa. No, this is a mix in here. He goes, well, yeah, it's like 60% alfalfa. I'm selling it for $14 a bale, or I'm selling, it depends where you're at. That could be expensive or cheap depending where you're at. But the price might reflect it. He might tell you that. He might be like, well, yeah, it's mainly alfalfa and it's cheap. And that might be a good enough reason to buy it right there. You know, price matters. Price is a real thing, you know. If you're trying to run an operation, you have to look at price. And some people don't. You know, some people go, oh, this hay is super cheap. Well, if the hay is super cheap and it has no nutritional value, and you're using it as feed, it's actually super expensive, because it's going to take way more just to keep your animals in the same condition. So you have to kind of know those details. And that's the crucial part. You know, the leafier it is, that's basically the term I can say. The leafier it is, the better. The stemmier it is, the worse. And you just kind of, you have to buy hay a few times, but like, that's a stem. Like, I wouldn't want to eat this. I don't want to eat a leaf, but I'd rather eat a leaf than this. And that's kind of how your sheep look at it with everything. So there's that. For our history lesson today, I think we'd talk about the cowboy era. You know, we're kind of in the animal business, and cowboys are cool. You know, when you think cowboy era, you think you know, Wild West. If you would ask somebody, hey, when's that time period of the Wild West? Like the part you think about from like the movies and stuff. It's like the John Wayne. Well, that whole area was a 25-year period, 20 to 25. And it was after the Civil War. The Civil War is in 1860 to 65-ish. Cowboys, Wild West starts in 66. And why would it start? Well, beef wasn't always a super common food source. Like, it was common to be eaten, but not common to be wanted, is a better way of putting it. But after the Civil War, people in the North, people on the East Coast wanted beef. What had happened during the Civil War? Well, all the young boys tending all the animals, and all the men tending the animals, went to fight from the South and from the North. Well, in the South, they had Texas longhorns and animals just like them, cattle just like them, basically just lean meat. And all those cattle were running the countryside because there's no fencing yet. There's no really big fencing operations by the country at that point. And so they were just down there breeding, and the boys were at war for 4 years, and, you know, a cattle population can double in 4 years. And they come back, and there's all these cattle running around, and when you think of, when I think of Abilene, I think of Abilene, Texas, but the Abilene in the Wild West was Abilene, Kansas. There's Abilene, Kansas, there's Ellsworth, and there's Dodge City. Now, most people know Dodge City. Get out of Dodge. Why is that a term? Because Dodge City is not a place you want to be back in the day. And why would that be? Why would Dodge City not be a place you want to be, or Abilene, or any of these places? Well, how we got the Cowboys were all these boys come back from the war, and there's all these cattle running, and the people want it. And the cattle are not worth much in the South, but they're worth a lot if you can get it to the East Coast. Well, how do you get them to the East Coast? Not railroads everywhere yet. Well, you'd have organizers, and they'd go hire these boys, these cowboys. That's how you get them. And a cowboy was worth to pay as much as they brought, really. If it was just a man, if it was just the person, well, then you have to supply. You were already going to supply food. And now you have to supply a horse and a saddle. So he's not worth a ton, but bodies are worth something. Willingness is worth something. And now if he brings a saddle, which a lot of them did, that was kind of the minimum. If he was worth a saddle, well, then you give him $10 extra for the trip. And if he brought his own horse, then you give him another $10 extra. So he might make $40 or something on the trip, something of the sort. And $40 was a lot more back then, obviously. So, and all the guys got paid at the end. The organizer got paid at the end. Everybody got paid at the end. So you'd round up your cowboys. Say you took a dozen, and you're taking hundreds of cattle, and you caught them all up, and then you trailed them. A cattle drive is what they call it. You drive them up to Kansas, and you do that for like 2 months. You'd sleep, and some cowboys would stay awake to make sure all the cattle didn't go disperse way too far. There's stampedes when thunderstorms came. It was a whole ordeal. The things you hear about it were true. But you drive them up, and when you got to Abilene, or you got to Ellsworth, or let's say Dodge City, they would load them up on them cattle cars. The organizer would get paid. He would pay out his cowboys, his 20-year-old and teenage cowboy men, mainly. And you could just imagine that. So they were broke before. They were broke the whole time on the trip. They didn't see any women on the trip. And now they're in a place with saloons, alcohol, brothels, women. They're the whole 9 yards, and they have like 2 months' wages. That's how long the trip took. So it's like a real chunk of change. This isn't like your weekly paycheck where it's like, oh, we could go do this on the weekend. It's like, no. This is like if you didn't get paid for 2 months, and then you get paid all at once, and then you go like, holy smokes, I got a chunk. That's what happened every time. And the boys would spend it pretty much every time. There wasn't a whole lot of smart cowboys. You go from a cowboy to a cowman. When you start making investments with that money, not a lot of them were. You don't hear about a lot of cowmen. So they would burn it all, and so that's where you'd hear about it. You'd hear about the shootings. A lot of these places were actually super safe. Like we hear about the most entertaining parts of them, but they were actually pretty dang safe. And that was kind of the whole era. And a lot of these boys would spend all their money, and then they'd come, so they'd have to go make more. So they'd go do another cattle drive and get up there and spend all their money and do it over and over and over again. The funny thing is that if you didn't die from old age or from like some fluke, during that time or something, you got trampled by a cow or your horse, you broke a rib or something. Like if you didn't die from something like that, you lived through the whole era. If you came back from the war in 65 and you were 20, by the time you were 45, it was over. And you say, well, what would have ended that? It sounds like a decent business. What would have ended it? Well, first of all, beef production started catching up and everything, so you couldn't just be a cowboy. You had to be a cowboy with the saddle, and then a little later, and they would provide the horses, and then a little later on, you had to be a cowboy with the saddle and a horse, so you were the whole man, and then you'd be getting paid less every time on these trips, and then eventually it was like you have to buy your food from the organizer every time, so it became less and less profitable for everybody involved. And the main thing that killed it was barbed wire. There was 3 guys that they were all buddies and businessmen. They all heard the same idea at the same time, and they all went to develop their own barbed wire. And the one that ended up winning, because a lot of the prototypes failed. Like imagine you had a wire, and every barb on a barbed wire is shaped the same way. It's say you take one wire like this, and you snip the ends. You just take a wire and you snip it at an angle so you get a point. And you did that on both sides. So now you got a pointy wire with 2 things. Well, you would bend it. It'd be straight, but you'd bend it with one loop in the middle. So now you got a hole, and it follows kind of like that. Okay, well, if you put one wire down the end of it and you put 100 barbs on it, they're all going to be loose. They're going to be coming down. Even if you tightened the barbs, like the wire, actually like tightened it around the middle wire, if a cattle hit it, it would push it. And it'll push them to the side, and then it defeats the point. So the way they discovered you could do it is you could do that, but to lock it right there, you'd have another wire come around super tight, like this is a type 2 wire, come around and it would cross over the barb, and then it'd go back around, so it would hold it there, and then it'd go over the next barb, and it would hold it there. So you had evenly spaced barbs on a barbed wire. And you could put that up, and they actually used to sell it by the pound, which is funny if you know anything about barbed wire, because nowadays they sell it by the mile. But back then they sold it by the pound. So you buy 50 pounds of barbed wire, because they sold it as a metal commodity, not necessarily by the mile, which is neat. That's a neat little fact. But that really ended it. You know, the peak of it, you know, Dodge City lasted the longest out of all the cowboy towns, really. Like, they all still exist pretty much, but Dodge City is the one that kind of really stuck around. And the cowboy was kind of done by the 1890s. And you can think about that because we had planes in World War I, and we were rolling into that in 1910. So from 1866 to about 1890, that was a 25-year period. The Wild Westerns, every single one you've ever seen, pretty much come from that period. And it's crazy to think it was that short of a period and how action-packed it was for movie making. But the idea is awesome. You know, the idea of having nothing. You're trailing cattle on horseback. You're sleeping on your horse with your horse blanket. Like, the idea is awesome, and it makes a great story, and that's why it took off as a space to explore. But we were talking about hay today. They didn't really use hay a ton back then. They did some. They didn't use it a ton back then. And when you use hay, make sure you're looking for leaf. You want leaf. Pay the price. Get your animals through the winter in good condition, and you'll be thanking yourself in spring when they're dropping lambs or calves. So I hope you all have a good one. Today's Memorial Day. You know, remember our fallen veterans, and I'll catch you on the next video.